Matthew 16, verse 5 to 12. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." "Be aware of their discussion," Jesus asked. "You of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you do not understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
So Jesus is re-entering the lands where his fellow Jews live. Magadan, at the end of chapter 15, is on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. And straight away, the Pharisees and Sadducees challenge Jesus. We've actually not seen the Sadducees since chapter 3. Jesus rebukes them and walks away. Well, he gets in the boat again and he addresses the disciples directly. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And here the disciples, they do a little bit of thinking. I want to give them a bit of credit here. They know that Jesus isn't warning them about physical yeast that the Jewish rulers might have. That indeed would be odd. So they look for a deeper meaning, but they miss the meaning. They decide that Jesus might be talking about bread. After all, they haven't brought any bread with them, and they're starting to get hungry. I don't know about you, but when I'm hungry, it's really easy to start thinking about food. That is what the disciples do here as well. Is Jesus saying that we didn't bring enough bread? Is he pointing that out? Well, no. Jesus overhears these mutterings, and again he uses the phrase, "You of little faith." The disciples must be tired of hearing this phrase by now. They've heard it at least 4 times. "You of little faith," says Jesus to the disciples. And Jesus seems to show the disciples that he indeed was being metaphorical. He wasn't talking about the yeast physically, but he was using the yeast metaphor to talk about teaching. The Pharisees' yeast or teaching is wrong. Their teaching is selfish, it's not godly. His teaching is good and godly. And to highlight his point, Jesus directs them to the feedings of the 4,000 and the 5,000. He reminds them, Jesus latterly did a miracle with bread. Not just one that made bread grow like yeast does, but a miracle that made the bread grow much more than any yeast on earth can do. One that leaves more leftovers than there was originally. And everyone was full to the brim. So Jesus taught for hours on end at these 2 events, and the followers lapped up every single word. They stayed until they were hungry and tired, but with Jesus you don't want to miss a word of what he has to say. Jesus fed them both physically and metaphorically. The bread filled their stomachs, and the yeast, or the bread of his teaching, his word, filled their mind. "How is it that you don't get it?" said Jesus. "How have you got the wrong end of the stick again?" As Jesus starts his return to Jerusalem, his disciples seem to still be confused about much of what Jesus is telling them and teaching them. And when Jesus is gone, he really wants the disciples to be able to identify good and bad teaching. Jesus wants his disciples to continue the work of speaking against the bad teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and to carry his message on further afield. The disciples don't see what is coming. But by the end of this passage, they are clear about what Jesus thinks of the teaching of the leaders of the day. Not much.